I'm Eric Ames. I'm a Waco author and historian and an adjunct lecturer in Baylor's Department of Museum Studies. So on May 11th, 1953, Waco is a city with a lot of positive things. It's got a thriving economy. We're in the post-World War II boom. We have businesses that are thriving downtown. We have jobs for people. Baylor is a growing reputation as an excellent educational center. And like often happens in Texas in the springtime, a storm front is on the way. And as it gets closer to the city, people are told, oh, there's nothing to worry about. This is just a regular old spring storm. Everything's going to be okay. Just go about life as usual. And so people went about their lives, but around 4 to 4:30 in the afternoon, as the storm got closer and closer to Waco, it became obvious that this wasn't just a standard storm. The storm approached downtown, and around 4:45 that afternoon, a massive tornado rips through downtown Waco. It's classified as the first F5 tornado in American history. It was extremely destructive. People ask, well, didn't they see it coming? Wasn't it like the tornadoes we see in The Wizard of Oz? It was not a classic cyclone shape from what we know. It was sort of hidden in the clouds and the wind and the rain and the debris that was whipped around. It just sort of moved through like a wall of destruction. When we think about downtown, one of the most iconic structures is the Alico building. And it was built in such a way that it had engineering from the start to withstand a storm like this. So it has a steel infrastructure. Its foundations go far into the ground to provide it extra stability. It had its own electrical generating plant, it had its own water supply, it had all of these things to be sort of a self-contained unit. And so when the tornado ran through that part of downtown, the Alico building tilted like it was designed to, but it didn't fall. And in fact, it maintained its power, and it was one of the few places in that part of downtown that still had electricity. And so if you look at an area of downtown now near the Alico, you'll see it stands by itself in that block. That's because the buildings that were near it were either damaged or destroyed in the tornado and then either demolished in the immediate aftermath or by the time of urban renewal in the 1960s. And so Waco's downtown went from thriving with lots of buildings that dated sometimes to the 1800s up to the 1950s to a place where you see this path of destruction through downtown. So the effects on Baylor kind of fall into two different buckets. There's the very personal effects as the way it relates to our faculty and our students at the time. And then there's the broader sort of psychological and economic effects. For the personal effects, we know of at least 4 people who were associated with Baylor who were killed in the storm. Ultimately, 114 people are documented as having died in the storm. And it does about $500 million worth of damage to Waco. That's in modern money, about $500 million. You do read about how right after the storm, people from all over rushed to help. So we know Baylor students were downtown during the storm. We know that they helped with recovery. We know that Baylor faculty, for example, helped in one very specific case, a very famous case. Dr. Packard was a very famous physics professor here at Baylor and had done some work with nuclear materials. And it was discovered that one of the buildings that was destroyed had housed a doctor's office. And this particular doctor would treat throat cancer with a tiny sliver of radium on a string that he would hold down the throat of the patients to kill the cancerous cells and then pull it out. Apparently he was treating someone during the storm when the building collapsed. And when they retrieved the doctor from the rubble, he just kept muttering about how we have to find the radium, because he knew it was radioactive and dangerous. So Dr. Packard and some colleagues here at Baylor were contacted because they had a Geiger counter, which could detect radioactivity. So they went downtown to the rubble of this building where the doctor's office had been, and they likened it to looking for a needle in a haystack. Well, in this case, you're looking for a radioactive needle in a pile of rubble. So they climbed all over it, and they looked and looked, and they couldn't find it, until finally they looked in a last scoop of rubble that had been picked up by a bulldozer, and the Geiger counter went crazy. And they reached down in and they pulled out this tiny sliver of radium, about the size of a pencil. And so they were able to get it back into a proper storage unit and get it away. I mean, if that had gotten thrown into just general rubble, it could have contaminated water nearby. It could have made other people who were moving it around sick. There's no telling what could have happened. But then you also had sort of the psychological impacts. After the storm, campus leaders got together and determined that if another tornado were to come through campus, like the one that had gone through downtown, one of the dangers that could come to the student body would be things falling from higher elevations onto students standing on the ground. So one of the decisions that was made was to remove the steeples from Old Main and Burleson halls. And those remained off of the tower of those buildings for a number of years before they were finally restored. You also saw, and you see to this day, the economic effects to Waco in general. Downtown has all of these gaps in the built environment where businesses had been that were either damaged or completely destroyed by the storm. And you see a perception that this storm was bad for Waco economically. Maybe I'm not going to send my child to go to school in Waco because they've had this major disaster. So while I don't know that the storm had a direct impact on enrollment, for example, I do know that it was something that people would consider as a reason to go or not go to Baylor after that storm. So if I was going to talk about a few of the important parts of the tornado's legacy in Waco, a few things I would say is it impacted people from all races, all classes, all jobs and walks of life because it hit in such a crucial part of the city of Waco. And so it was one of those examples where it brought people together and uniting to recover and to rebuild in a way that sometimes tragedies do. I think it's also important to remember that Waco has been resilient. There were periods after the tornado where downtown, it doesn't thrive like it had before the storm, but Waco has tried and is successful today in revitalizing large portions of downtown, even after something as devastating as that storm. I think the biggest lesson for me, though, is when we lead these tornado walks that I've been doing for the last few years, or we talk to people about the storm, there's always someone that comes up to me and shares a story. They'll say, oh, I remember that my dad went to work that day and he came home and was just completely traumatized by what he'd seen downtown, and it took him years before he was finally kind of back to normal. Those stories are important, but we're losing those survivors every year, just like World War II survivors, Korean War survivors. So if you know someone here in Waco that experienced that storm, sit down with them, get the camera on your phone out, or just turn on the recording and sit there and talk to them. Get those stories down, because we are rapidly losing the folks who experienced it firsthand. So I would say those are probably the biggest lessons, is just talk to people who were a part of it and remember that these shared traumatic experiences, we can all pitch in and still survive and thrive after those things occur.